Is it autism? Or is it
Now, if you're someone that truly is suffering from
expression?
ADHD,
What's that aside from this?
Diagnosing ADHD, autism, and other neurodevelopmental disorders is a nuanced and often complex process. These conditions can present differently from one person to another, and symptoms may overlap or be influenced by environment, age, or co-occurring challenges. It's essential that we rely on objective, evidence-based methods, standardized assessments, interviews, history, and real-world observations. Approaching each person without assumptions help us avoid stereotypes and misdiagnosis, especially as awareness of neurodevelopmental conditions grows. Most importantly, when we look beyond symptoms and understand the whole individual, we're able to offer support that truly fits their needs. So globally, we are dealing with a pandemic of its own, and no, it's not another strain of COVID, but it's actually the ADHD and autism spectrum disorders that we are dealing with. Nearly half of children in schools these days can't concentrate, and that's not even necessarily diagnosed children. What's your stance on this as a functional doctor?
Because I think I first need to just explain the basics of the diagnosis and the tools we use how to come to specific diagnosis, because there are many measurement tools. I don't believe in some of our spectrum kits we have the right diagnostic tools developed yet, because we don't understand what we're measuring all the time. So from a medical perspective and a functional medicine perspective, we usually tend to get the patients after they get the golden handshake from specialists or GPs or medical practitioners following classic conventional models. And then they get that golden handshake of saying, listen, now you need to do therapies, and after that, start getting creative. That's typically the go-to answer that the parents receive. So the parents are desperate. They're looking for qualified and certified clinicians and doctors who understand the neurodevelopmental disorders, which is the couple term, the big category into which all these spectrum and ADD, ADHD kids resort. So the parents are looking for answers. They're looking for doctors who are qualified to actually deal with their children. And doctors are looking for peer-reviewed, published articles and good research and consistent research to actually address their patients with special needs and with these spectrum kits. So from a functional point of view, it's a very difficult one to pin down what the exact diagnosis is, because it's a spectrum on all cases, especially with neurodevelopment. I mean, a patient with cerebral palsy, you understand there's a specific genetic profile, there's a specific injury that occurred, and then you generally know what the pathway is the patient can follow. But with the ADD, ADHD, autism kids, it's a very wide diagnosis and approach that doctors follow. So I think we're still tweaking the definitive diagnosis. There are great measurement tools that psychiatrists and neurologists and pediatricians use to actually make and confirm the definitive diagnosis. But from a medical point of view, it's certainly an interesting field we find ourselves in.
The causes of ADHD and autism are complex, involving a strong genetic foundation influenced by a range of environmental factors. Research consistently shows that these conditions are highly heritable, with multiple genes contributing to differences in brain development and functioning. Understanding ADHD and autism as a result of a dynamic interplay between genetics and environment helps us move away from myths and towards a clearer, science-based picture, one that respects the complexity of neurodevelopment and the diversity of the people it shapes. They say that there's a rise in diagnosis for ADHD as well as autism, and we'll get into the autism just now. But is ADHD underdiagnosed and autism, or do you think it's more prevalent these days? Do we see it more? Do we see it less? Why?
So there's a group of the academic researchers that tend to say that because the tools are being developed to pick them up either earlier or be more inclusive of certain traits and signs and symptoms, that's the reason in the rise of the prevalence of the conditions. For me, I do think that our environment has changed a lot from 50 years ago. After the Second World War, if you just look at the amount of plastic, for instance, that's just been dumped into our systems just burdening our livers, metabolisms, detoxification systems. It's been a huge part of the environment contributing to dysfunction in our metabolism and in our bodies that leaded to it just manifesting earlier or just pulling a genetic trigger earlier so that we actually start to see the signs and symptoms clinically manifest.
Do you think that we see people with ADHD or autism really struggling much more now, that they are less functional now than maybe 50 years ago? Do you think that can also be one of the reasons why it possibly was missed 50 years ago, and that there would be a grandchild or great-grandchild that would be diagnosed now?
So yes and no. So first and foremost, the stigma for the whole family. Because remember, the child that comes to the physician or the doctor is either XY or XX chromosome. So that means mom and dad had a contribution in that. And that means 25% back going 1 or 2 generations, 12.5 or 10% back had a contribution to this product. So if the parents are shy to go for the formal diagnosis because that stigma of, okay, but whose family is now at fault? So who's the main contributor? Is it the X's or the Y's? Is it the male or the female and the grandparents in that lineage, or the grandparents in that lineage? So I think that's why some parents shy away from going for a formal assessment with a speech therapist, occupational therapist, and a multidisciplinary team to really get to a proper definitive diagnosis once again. So I do think that 50 years ago, the environment was less toxic and it was less burdensome on our brains, on our bodies. If you just take a look at how social media has influenced influencers becoming influenced on social media, and just with all the dopamine surges just going around with instant gratification, this instant world, everything needs to be instant, and dopamine actually being depleted, instead of just getting a child outside playing and just being stimulated and growing up naturally with an innate immune system that builds up and that's just created as they do life with their friends and all the rest, instead of putting them in this bubble of 2025, for instance, with a huge environment that's changed, end products for the consumer that's changed. Everybody's so driven by quality and sensitive on pricing. If you look at products on the shelf, have to maintain a specific shelf life. Otherwise, the sales go down, or you don't see it as a good investment, and you tend to go for the ones with a longer shelf life. And the ones with a longer shelf life are more toxic and more potent, with more artificial stuff and more harmful toxins in there to actually get those mutations and genetic profile to change and to actually manifest.
I hear so many older people that would say, back in my day, there was no such thing as ADHD or autism. The scientists are very conflicted currently about what causes autism, what causes ADHD. What would you say is the root cause?
So the root cause for any of the neurodevelopmental disorder classification cluster of challenges with all those complexities, I do believe have the biggest backdrop in a genetic pool, in a genetic predisposition. And once that genetic predisposition is actually seen as a loaded gun, so it's mutations that are packaged but that are still silent, so it's like a loaded gun being handed to the world and the environment, and then you get contributing factors and causative factors that start pulling triggers. And those genetic mutations then start to activate and not be silent anymore, but they actually glitch and they actually switch on, and then they start producing the protein that's harmful, that exhibits the negative symptom.
So you basically say that ADHD and autism, according to you, is genetic.
So genetic predisposition is a big thing, and because we have a population that's ever expanding, but we still very diverse, but also cultural. So we tend to stick to culture generally. So we tend to marry the same people generally in a culture, where I believe if you actually leave your culture and you go outside of the culture, you're going to get a more diverse stronger genetic pool that you're going to see less mutations because you're going to import stronger genes again. So from a genetic point of view, I'm going to stick to my answer. It's safe, it's proven, it makes sense to a lot of people. There's no blame shifting, blame games that comes from this generation or that family lineage, but it makes a lot of sense because it takes a lot of the blame away from the parents and the grandparents, especially if they're sensitive and coming from families with hierarchy and good names and good families and good family values. It takes away that whole blame game that the parents tend to shift on. Was this my fault? What did I do wrong? So we see a lot of moms and dads coming thinking, was it when she fell off the bed? Was it when he fell off the treehouse? Was it, so they're always looking for a trauma or acute infection that they neglected for a little bit to see, was that the cause? So that wasn't the cause. That was maybe the incident that triggered the loaded gun and that fired the shot, but that definitely wasn't the cause. The cause, I believe, is a very, very specific genetic predisposition.
Would you then list some of these possible triggers for me, even if they are, not as big or such a big event, but small things that can trigger it?
So some of them are big events and some of them are very controversial, but I am very controversial. So people listening to the message will be in good company if they also see themselves as being disruptive and controversial. So from a trigger point of view, and just bringing all these silent mutations to come to a glitch or to come to an active state coding for harmful toxic proteins in our own bodies could be something like a big infection. So, and this is not just a neglected sinusitis, it could just be sinusitis. Or it could be an abscess that becomes septicemia, and now you've got this blood-borne disease, and all of a sudden the mutations respond very negatively, either to the infection itself, to the antibiotic being administered, the immune response reacting to the combination of medication, or just the disease being present in the body, and all of a sudden these mutations start to activate and manifest. And you usually see some of them immediately, some within 24 hours, some you see gradually in the onset, but usually where you see any regression or any level of previous functioning that's been lost, that's when you can actually go back and then you can do a root diagnosis, a root cause of what was the specific trigger for that specific patient. Some things that people won't always acknowledge is maybe something like a big trauma, a life event, the passing away of a sibling, the passing away of a significant other. So that big traumatic event, doing something from a genetic and epigenetic pool where your vagal nerve or your gut or your brain or the neurotransmitter profile just all of a sudden coming under a specific acute injury, and then the genetic mutation then activating, producing toxic proteins as an after effect. Also, the environment plays a huge role. I mean, taking 50 years back, there were less pesticides, there were less harmful environmental toxins and inhalants and poisons, and less toxic stuff in our drinking water, less toxins in our agricultural soil. I mean, the topsoil in agriculture is a very controversial topic, but I mean, the quality of the topsoil in agriculture has diminished so much over the last 30 to 40 years. It's hair-raising to see what you actually find in a potato or in a strawberry compared to what you found nutrition-wise 50 years ago. Even if you look just at specific toxins and pesticides that you find in a food plate compared to what was discovered 50 years ago, there's a vast difference. I mean, I know there was a study that was once done in one of our South African local universities, and they discovered 17 toxic, harmful pesticides and herbicides in a full-fledged potato that land on our plate, and we think it's a whole food, a good carbohydrate in the skin, 17 harmful neurotoxins in that specific fleshy vegetable, and we consume it. We dunk it into hot oil and we deep fry it. We dunk it into water and boil it, and you aggravate all those toxins, and guess what the result is? It activates those genetic mutations that lie silently, and all of a sudden the toxic protein starts to code in that specific patient.
I'm going to poke the bear now, and vaccinations.
So vaccines are a big, not so controversial topic anymore. I know the pharmaceutical companies will sit up right now and listen to what we say, but it's been proven. I mean, the COVID pandemic is just something of the past now, so it's all of our short-term memories and recent medical histories. So if the CDC and WHO and all these big pharmaceutical companies start to offer vaccine injury protocols, and big names in the international medical world start to come up with ways how to viral out or treat patients with a vaccine injury, all of a sudden it's not just a subjective little hearsay thing. So all of a sudden the pharmaceutical world is taking note. All of a sudden the parents are taking note and they asking for delayed vaccine protocols, especially if a sibling has already been affected in the family. I know it's one of the reasons for medical certificate exemption. If a sibling in the family already has a condition in the neurodevelopmental camp and diagnosis, that the siblings may actually have a delayed vaccine regime or delayed vaccine protocol. So vaccines is, unfortunately, it looks as if it's one of the big triggers, and especially the newer vaccines that fiddle around with genetic material and mRNA type of vaccine. So it's something that goes and it lies embedded in our DNA, in our genetic material, and there's a code and a protein that's been GMO'd and genetically modified to cause a specific immune response in our bodies, but our bodies read it wrong and it starts activating for very harmful mutations and proteins and antibody production.
That's so interesting. For the first time I understand, because I always feel like there's this anti-vaxxer community and this causes autism, and on the other side you've got the medical community that will argue, but it's so safe. It makes complete sense to me that it just triggers an already loaded gun. Treating ADHD and autism involves a multidisciplinary approach tailored to each person's unique needs. A holistic treatment plan adds layers of support that can improve daily functioning, emotional regulation, and quality of life. By integrating scientific understanding with personalized strategies, we can better support individuals in ways that are both effective and respectful of their neurodiversity. So, Doc, let's say a child had this genetic predisposition. There was a trigger. Now what? You know, the parent got this diagnosis, got the little letter in the pocket. What now?
So this whole diverse group of complexities that we classify under neurodevelopmental delay and disorders, once again the word I don't really like. But what happens if you get the diagnosis and now you've got this challenge and now you've got this whatever looks like a trait that could be a disorder, and how to approach that. So remember, it's a spectrum. So some patients are affected significantly and they regress significantly. Some patients are affected only in one subset of their genetic material and chromosomes, and then you address it. So once again, we get back to what are we measuring and what's the message that we actually try to get out there. So we need to know exactly what the diagnosis is, because once you have a definitive diagnosis, you have a definitive protocol that you can offer families living with spectrum children, patients living with special needs children, patients living with disabilities. And let me be very frank, some patients are really minimally affected and they are not in the classification of a disability. They might be differently abled still with a high potential and high IQ and all the rest, but from a practical management point of view, we need to know what we are diagnosing. So I love to have a subset of DNA analysis and genetic material, or just polymorphisms that you can typify them to say we know commonly these occur, and you measure for those polymorphisms or genetic mutations, and if they occur on the patient's priority list as an area that you should see a big deal of priority to, like for instance a very disruptive methylation panel, then you need to start with that as a point of departure to see if you can manage some symptoms, turn around those traits before they become diagnosed as a disorder.
So Doc, what do you do when someone arrives at your practice or contacts the practice and says, listen, I've got this diagnosis, now what?
Okay, so if we come to a very sensitive family and you can see that the mom and dad want to do the blame shifting or they're just really looking for the answer, you don't offer a diagnosis immediately. So first what we do is we measure. So a very quick, easy, one-step little prick of blood, you do a DNA test. So it's a blood sample or a buccal swab of saliva that we send away off to a laboratory, and they give us the mutations, the genetic biological areas that we know commonly affect most people. So you'll probably get a 70% part of the population information on that specific patient that you can know if you treat any of the mutations that's been activated or that's in a very high classification, high priority mutation. You will probably start seeing less symptoms and you will start seeing an improvement of the specific challenge or condition. So it's a once-off test and you get this wealth of information that you've got with your patient and the whole patient family. So remember, the patient, the child, has a subset of the genes of the parent. So you know 25 to 50% of the parent's profile as well by just looking at the child's genetic result. So from a medical perspective, it gives you a wealth of knowledge on how to approach and manage that specific family.
Doc, I'd like for us to really get into the specific genes that you do look for and that you do test. So the first one being inflammation. So I know that there's various genes affecting this. Why is it important and how do you treat it?
Okay, so in the previous episode, we alluded to blood tests that can be done for inflammation, so you can measure functional levels of inflammation and actually treat them. So usually when they appear on the blood test, it means genetically they're somewhere downstream and they've already activated, and that's why you're starting to detect them functionally on a blood test. So then you go to the genetic panel on the DNA kit and you look for the inflammation profile. The ones that you generally never want to be affected at all is interleukin 6. It is like the pit bull of the inflammation panels on gene mutations. So, I mean, you can always get rid of a pit bull by pulling in a bigger dog or anything, but a pit bull generally tends to never give up. So that's quite a big challenge. So interleukin 6, you look for TNF-alpha. So the long name for that's a very scientific name. It sounds very horrible, and it's called tumor necrosis factor alpha. But all it basically says is how predisposed that specific patient is in producing inflammation, and once there's inflammation, how bad or how well they can manage it, and what type of free radical profiles you need to be very concerned about as aggravators in compounding that inflammation profile. Then you get your interleukin 6s, and there are plenty of them, many of them, and some are just easily treatable, easily manageable, but the interleukin 6 and the TNF-alpha, or if you have more than one interleukin 1 profile that's been affected in a high priority classification, then you know you've got a challenge on your hands.
So how do you deal with that challenge?
From a management perspective, we always get the patients to understand that inflammation is now activated from a genetic point of view. We can measure it on the bloods, and we inform the family members, and especially the parents, that, listen, inflammation is managed how? By anti-inflammatory principles. So, and it's not by necessarily just dumping Nurofen or ibuprofen or diclofenac into their systems, because long-term that has deleterious health effects. So, but you need to start limiting other inflammation-causing agents in that patient profile and system, starting off with food. So we know the big ones are the sugars, the refined sugars, the refined GMO proteins, including whey, gluten, including wheat, including dairy products. So from an exclusion point of view, there's a very, very specific approach they can follow instantly after receiving the information, that they can start excluding any aggravating circumstances. So when we start doing that, within 2 weeks, usually, the parents come back and start giving very subtle but very positive hints that they start seeing improvements. When it comes to a child that has a very specific regression in either personality or performance or say, for instance, a speech that's been regressed or delayed, then we look at small little hints of improvements, feedback from the therapist, speech therapy, occupational therapy, to see that we are on the right pathway in addressing that specific inflammation panel and profile. So from a treatment point of view, my top of the list would probably be go to fix up the meal plan. And we like to just dump in all the anti-inflammatory foods as much as we can, within moderation, and also just keeping common sense and just keeping it sustainable, but really just getting the inflammation drivers down, and then to start adding some omega-3 high-potency fish oil to the treatment supplement regime. You can start adding a little bit of curcumin or turmeric either into the food or as a supplement. It's a very, very potent anti-inflammatory. You can start looking at incorporating some natural oils just in the food, cold press, preferably high quality type of oils that you can use in the food sense, that they can just drive down inflammation, and then start measuring and looking at how the patient's feedback.
I'm so interested because if you test a patient's DNA, the inflammation marker will not just have an impact on their brain. So if you were just a neurologist or an occupational therapist, you would obviously look at the brain and how this function or how this will have an impact. But with this child, if there's an inflammation challenge, that will obviously be for the whole body. So how does this affect the immune system or any other normal day-to-day task?
Okay, so very good question. And if you just think of the body as a whole, so if you consider a burn wound on a skin, the skin has got ample room to expand after the injury. So you get an injury, you've got this huge water blister that forms, then the blister consolidates and forms the scab, and then the healing pathway starts. What happens in the brain specifically of these neurodevelopmental delay and disorder groups? So the brain is contained in a skull. So the brain, after injury or inflammation, can only expand, if you will, up to a point, and then it's contained in the skull. So you still have the same cause and effect that you see on the skin with injury, that you can visibly see the expansion, but in a brain it typically manifests as either a delay in milestones, or they present with meltdowns, or they present with headaches, and they can't always specifically say it's a headache like we understand headache. You just see a change in personality, or you see a change in behavior, or you see a regression or a delay in milestones. And then you know that you're already dealing with neuroinflammation because it is systemic. So the same principle applies. You lower inflammation in the body, in the gut microbiome, the brain responds and it cools down. And the brain has less swelling and less compression and less dysfunction, and all of a sudden you have the opportunity for a short window to catch up and to get the rehabilitation and regeneration going again.
So would a child, for instance, with this specific gene also maybe have a lowered immune system?
So the immune systems aren't necessarily lowered, they are dysregulated. So that means they can be either compromised, so they're very immunocompromised, as in patients with low immune systems. Think now of patients undergoing chemotherapy with a specific cancer regime or protocol where we have to control the immune system down so that the cancer drugs can work. So it's very immunocompromised, or you get the immune system that is in overdrive or hyper alert. And then all of a sudden the immune system can become so vigilant that for a normal small injury that you would allocate a specific growth factor or curative pathway, the body now goes and says, for a paper cut in my body, I'm doing a 911 call and I'm looking for a paramedic or a doctor to come and do a house call. Instead of just going to the kitchen, just doing a little bit of appropriate wash and a plaster, they've got this overactive hyperimmune dysregulation because of that inflammation that's mutating.
How would that in normal terms present?
Normal terms, typically a change in behavior, typically in a meltdown, typically in a decrease in academic performance. So you'll see small cues, but that can have very big results in the end. So the minute you start seeing your child or a patient just deviating from their normal patterns, and that can be either aggression, it can be a meltdown, it can be excessive sleeping or no sleeping. So if their sleep hygiene all of a sudden changes, or they start presenting with night terrors, or they start presenting with nightmares, or they have a regression where someone was potty trained and all of a sudden they start wetting the bed again. Any significant change in the social cues for that family should be on high alert if they see that.
Methylation is a key biochemical process that supports many functions in the body, including neurotransmitter production, detoxification, immune regulation, and overall cellular health. Researchers have explored how variations in methylation-related genes may influence the experiences of some individuals with ADHD or autism. Certain genetic differences can affect how efficiently a person methylates, which may in turn influence energy levels, mood regulation, or how the body processes certain nutrients. It's important to emphasize that these genetic variations highlight that people process biochemistry in diverse ways. For individuals with neurodevelopmental conditions, supporting healthy methylation through nutrition, medical guidance, and targeted supplementation can be part of a broader approach to well-being. While research is ongoing, understanding methylation offers another piece of the puzzle in personalizing care. Doc, then the next one I'd like to ask about is methylation. So I know that there's a bunch of genes that's really affected by that, but can you please list some of those genes?
Okay, so not all the patients are aware that we do these DNA tests, so let me just quickly explain what methylation means just in everyday sense. So that's the body's ability to repair after an injury. So the body's ability to repair DNA. So in every cell you've got this genetic material compounds. The minute the cell dies off, then the body actually dumps, if you will, all the genetic material and cell debris into the system, and the body needs to clear that with a specific mechanism. So if you've got a poor methylating patient, it means they may have a slower ability to heal a specific injury. And if they have a lesser ability to heal an injury, it obviously means that the cell fragments that lie around waiting for the cleaning mechanism and the detox and the elimination system to excrete and eliminate those, it gives the opportunity for secondary injuries to start occurring. Because now you've got fragments of proteins and amino acid sequences lying around, and those can actually have an altered immune response because it's actually foreign to the body that there's a cell that undergoes cell death and it's not adequately eliminated in time. So from a medical point of view, we always try to explain to patients that it's just a different ability for that body to heal. And now we need to first measure it, manage it, address the shortfalls and address the specific deficiencies in B vitamins. So that's the big panel that we actually test in the methylation health priority area, because that's the body's ability to convert inactive B vitamins to an active state or a methylated state. So say, for instance, you get folic acid into your body has to have the ability to activate or transfer a methyl group to the folic acid to turn it into folate. So folate is the one that's absorbable, that's active, and that does the healing and the repairing. Folic acid is a water-soluble vitamin, and if it's not converted into folate, you actually just lose it through your excretion in the urine. So then it really becomes just playing catch up. So if you've got a specific methylation challenge, and there are many methylation panels that we test for in the methylation health area, then you may have a bigger problem on your hands than normally, but the big ones is called the MTHFR, or like the moms with special needs in the families refer to that as the mother fluffer gene. So from a medical perspective, that's an easy solution, but it does take time. And depending on the dysfunction or the dysregulation that's happened and the type of injury that the patient's had, it determines the time that we're going to have to catch up and repair and actually get back to the previous level of functioning. The other one in methylation is called the COMT. So that's a transferase enzyme that actually helps the body regulate homocysteine to a big degree in the body. And that's the one that we can measure in the bloodstream to see how well that transferase enzyme is actually neutralizing and up and down regulating homocysteine, and then also estrogen metabolism. So from a estrogen dominance point of view or estrogen metabolite point of view, it's easy test once you've got that genetic information to measure in a patient to see are they eliminating estrogen in a very toxic metabolite format, and that you can actually alter the way that the liver detoxifies that estrogen metabolite into a safer estrogen metabolite that causes less harm.
Doc, so with the B vitamins, I know dosaging is such an uncertain topic. What's your go-to B vitamin dosages?
Well, the dosages are never RDA, unfortunately. So RDA is the recommended daily allowance. Remember, those are the ones that was put down by the health organizations international to not have any patient go into a malnourished state. So what we see now with all the mutations and with these methylation poor patients is that they actually have big injuries. We have to give therapeutic dosages. We generally base them on body mass, like for instance, methylated vitamin B12. There's a beautiful protocol that was developed by Dr. Neuenbrander that actually figured out the exact dose of methylated vitamin B12 to assist the children on the spectrum, albeit ADHD, ADD, autism, CP children, cerebral palsy patients that really are poor methylators. And the minute you give the methylated vitamin B12 pertaining to body kilogram, body mass, you see a tremendous result. So some patients can get as much as 7,500 micrograms of vitamin B12 activated instead of just your standard normal dose of 400, 500, 600 micrograms of unmethylated or non-methylated B vitamins. So the methylated ones are absorbed and they're usable and they can effect change and reparative mechanisms. The ones that aren't methylated, you literally just water out.
I know that many parents will be able to take out a 4,500 or 5,000 rand for these genetic tests, but we do know that there's, in our country for sure, a lot of parents who cannot afford this. Is there a minimum dose of, let's say, a 7-year-old child weighing 25 kilograms? What would be your minimum dose of B12, the methylated B12?
So just on the methylation again, so remember methylation is a biochemical process that takes place 1 billion times per second in each patient's system, and it's a water-soluble vitamin. So the minute you compare B12 versus methyl B12, you have this almost like slow release effect. So the half-life of a normal straightforward vitamin B12 is like minutes. The half-life of methylated B12, for instance, goes up to 6 days in some cases. So if you take a 25 kilogram 7-year-old boy, you would probably go 84.5 micrograms per body kg. So that is Dr. James Neubrander's protocol. And he just happened to stumble upon methyl B12 in 2002 when he just coincidentally discovered that his spectrum children did better on methyl B12 than just B12. So his protocol that's been implemented in the Medical Academy of Pediatric Special Needs in our organization, so it actually stipulates 84.5 mcgs, micrograms per body kilogram. So for that 25 kilogram 7-year-old boy, I'd probably say 2,000 to 2,500 micrograms of methylated B12. And I would start off with 2 to 3 times per week. And then you tandem that, if you consider cerebral folate deficiency, which is the fancy term for brain deficiency of vitamin B9 or folate, then you would probably combine folate with B12, not necessarily in the same injection, but in the same session, and you would probably go for 60% of the same dose. And so I like to tandem them together because then you just optimize your patient's ability to methylate well. And now that boy is able to upregulate his genes, in other words, cause that switch on, switch off effect of the dysregulated genes. You have him optimize his neurotransmitter balance, so all of a sudden he can regulate his own mood a lot better, regulate his own sleep balance. So from just a methylation point of view and the optimal dose, you just give that boy the world of an advantage to actually detoxify optimally, to balance his own hormones optimally, as we've mentioned, neurotransmitter balance, and you just give him the ability to upregulate his immune system. You give him the ability to actually activate some production of antioxidants in the body like glutathione. So you just give him the world of an advantage by giving him a methylated B vitamin. So if you can't afford to do the gene testing, at least that's a good starting point.
Doc, so obviously kids on the spectrum is very famous for being picky eaters as well. What can we do to get this into their bodies?
Okay, so notoriously medium tasters according to the genetic profiles, the gene testing method and the word specifically there. So in my opinion, I'd say as long as you get it in, it's better than not having it. And as long as you can get in a methylated B vitamin complex instead of not methylated. So if you had to be 100% convinced that your patient's gut and digestive tract is not compromised or dysregulating, then you can probably go for oral dosages, and you can try to get it in either xylitol-coated sweet chew tablets or gummies or whatever. If you've got that little sugar spike, that's going to be the least of the evils, in my opinion, because you need to get the methyl compounds in. So once they get it in, and it can even be a sublingual droplet that you can just try to get it through the mucosal absorption, then you can also bypass the digestive tract a little bit. But the best way will just be a subcutaneous injection to cause that slow release. You start off with 2 to 3 times a week, and you'll probably find that as that half-life of the methylated Bs start to increase, you actually get to a very good saturated point in the bloodstream, because you bypass the liver, you bypass the digestive tract. You're 100% sure you've got your full absorption because it's available in the bloodstream immediately.
Can you just clarify for me, because, you know, if I was a mom of a child who I need to inject 2 to 3 times a week, injections is a scary topic. What would the syringe look like? Is it a big needle? Do I have to do it into the muscle? Is it technical at all?
So it's not very technical. You just need to know your dose, but the doctor will generally partner up with you and work out the dosages and the dosages intervals for you. So, I mean, it's an insulin diabetic type syringe. The needle is typically 3 to 5 millimeters long, and it's typically a 30 gauge needle. So that's the same size for anybody who's ever been for a Botox injection or anybody that's ever been for any eye procedure. It's the thinnest, finest needle that you do find, and it only has to be injected subcutaneously. So you don't even have to do, Dr. James Newbrander actually proved that intramuscular versus subcutaneous, you actually get a slower release effect when it's just subcutaneous.
So just for the normal people, non-medical out there, subcutaneous is into the fat, intramuscular into the muscle.
So literally into the muscle versus just under the skin. So subcutaneous or just into the fatty layer before you even eat the muscle. That's the sweet spot.
Supporting the body's natural detoxification systems is an important part of maintaining overall health, especially for individuals who may be more sensitive to environmental stresses. The body relies heavily on antioxidants like glutathione, one of the most powerful internal detoxifiers, to neutralize harmful substances and support cellular repair. N-acetylcysteine, or NAC, is often discussed because it helps replenish glutathione levels and plays a role in managing oxidative stress. Doc, so then we get to detoxing. So on your genetic testing, I know that you test if the child can detox. How does this typically work?
So detoxification is a big point of attention, especially for the universities, because they test for liver cells and they check if the liver has got the ability to absorb, metabolize, and eliminate toxins or chemicals or medication or certain toxic effects. So detox is your body's ability to take a very fat-soluble, very toxic compound, to break it down into smaller pieces and metabolize it so that it can become water-soluble, less toxic, and that you can actually excrete it in either urine or in bile. In other words, you either wee it out or out in stool. So from a medical point of view, that's the liver's ability to fully metabolize and break down any toxic or harmful compound so that your body is at a stage where it can eliminate the toxin favorably.
So if a child does not really detox properly, do we put them on a juice cleanse or what do we do?
So a juice cleanse and little pats under the feet at the spa is not going to quite do the trick. So we're going to have to at least assist their liver to really get to adequate levels of antioxidant in the liver. And the body's master antioxidant is a substance called glutathione. So you even need methylated B12 to manufacture glutathione in the body. That's why methylation and detox go hand in hand. So glutathione is the end product, coincidentally, of a substance called N-acetylcysteine. In South Africa, people will commonly know it as ACC 200 or ACC 600, the little effervescent tablet for flu. So ACC 200 and 600 has nothing to do with flu. That was a coincidental finding. So the pharmaceutical company was just very clever to buy very consistent, good marketing and research and stick their label claim on top of that. But N-acetylcysteine is the natural antidote for paracetamol poisoning. So if you phone the poison center in South Africa today and you tell them you have a patient or a granny or a friend who's overdosed on paracetamol, the center will tell you, listen, get hold of some N-acetylcysteine to actually eliminate. That's the natural antidote for paracetamol overdose. So from a medical point of view, you actually want to get the N-acetylcysteine into your patient's system, give the patient the ability to convert to some glutathione, and glutathione we know is the master scavenger for free radicals and oxidants. That's why we call it antioxidant, because the minute metabolism starts in the body, your body starts to oxidize. So you want to get that antioxidant to a level where you just give the patient the benefit of the doubt to at least be able to neutralize some of the harmful oxidants in their bodies potentially.
I know that sometimes you suggest to patients to do the NAC or the ACC route, and sometimes glutathione. Is there a specific reason why the difference, or is it just because of how it's applied? Or
So some patients, if you've got the genetic information, some patients, believe it or not, are actually sometimes born with a gene deletion. So that means they are 3 to 4-fold reduced in their ability or capacity to actually produce and form glutathione. So when it's a gene deletion, and generally I treat all my patients as having a deletion until I get to a saturation level, and then clinical results and feedback that's usually positive, and then we start tapering them down to a maintenance dose. So I usually view all patients as being very deficient initially of enough antioxidants because we're so burdened with all these toxins, antibiotics, food, pesticides, plastic compounds, everything just we have in the environment, in the air that we breathe in our food and food substances, even plastic compounds that can seep into drink water. If you don't treat your drinking water in your plastic bottle with respect in a car, putting it down in a car, and you've got all those plastic compounds seeping through into the drinking water, you're actually busy diluting down your own antioxidant pool to be able to fight for normal mechanisms in your body. So I always like to just give them the best of both worlds, so the raw material, the building block, and then the end product as well.
the gut-brain axis refers to the dynamic two-way communication system between the digestive tract and the central nervous system. Far more than a simple connection, this network involves the gut microbiome, the immune system, hormones, and neural pathways such as the vagus nerve. Together they influence mood, cognition, stress responses, and overall neurological function. Emerging research shows that the balance of bacteria in the gut can affect inflammation, neurotransmitter production, and even behavior, highlighting how closely our digestive system is tied to our mental and emotional well-being. There's a lot of research currently going on. We know there's a lot of podcasts currently about the gut and the brain and how they connect. Firstly, I want you to explain this connection to me. And then secondly, how does this impact a child or a person, an adult, living with any neurological special needs?
So from a gut-brain axis point of view, it's got the primary function of connecting the brain and brain function with your digestive tract. And if you just look at how intrinsically they are interlinked, the main connection between them isn't just your body, because your own brain is in your own body and your gut is in your own body, but there's an intrinsically woven nerve that connects the brain, the longest nerve in the body. It's called the wandering nerve, the vagal nerve. and it directly connects the brain to the gut and the digestive tract. So if you see any gut dysregulation, gut dysbiosis, not optimal gut functioning, people will speak of irritable bowel syndrome. They will speak of leaky gut syndrome, where the mucosal lining is disrupted and the tight junctions aren't functioning optimally for absorption and for toxin elimination. The minute you get to a gut that is disrupted, the gut microbiome that's changed, and it doesn't carry the microflora and the probiotics it's supposed to carry, you actually disconnect the body and the brain from communicating optimally from a neurotransmitter point of view. You disconnect the brain and the body from a communication point of view, so there's delayed cell-to-cell communication. So the gut and brain connection, besides the fact that it's just connected by one strand of very vital nerve, it's a great topic of research, and I think the next Nobel Prize is actually going to be awarded to the team who actually uncovers the whole gut microbiome and what strand of specific probiotic and probiflora could be beneficial in this group of neurodiverse patients of ours.
Ozone therapy is an alternative medical approach that uses a highly reactive form of oxygen, ozone, to stimulate various physiological responses. We use this therapy to support circulation, immune activity, and the body's natural healing processes. We see a lot of people posting about ozone therapy in ozone chambers. Do you think it's a bunch of nonsense, or do you believe in ozone therapy?
So in our rehab center, we actually have an ozone chamber ourselves, and we utilize it in our own house as well, just from a optimization point of view. So ozone is really a great addition, and it's part of the toolbox for parents and doctors embracing the approach of how to treat the patient holistically. I mean, it's been discovered many years ago. It's medical oxygen connected to a generator and a converter of medical oxygen, where your principle basically is oxygenation, so better oxygen into the blood, and also a mechanism to assist your detox abilities of your body. As your skin is your largest organ system in the body, so we know that a lot of toxins are released through perspiration, through respiration, breathing. So the ozone chamber for me, and ozone therapy in general, is a go-to standalone therapy that's good on its own. It generally works well and complements all other detox and treatment modalities in any case.
Photomodulation, often referred to as low-level light therapy or red light therapy, is a non-invasive treatment that uses specific wavelengths of light to influence cellular function. When these wavelengths reach the cells, they interact with the mitochondria, the cell's energy centers, to support improved energy production, reduce oxidative stress, and promote tissue repair. Doc, I want to get to photomodulation. On the internet, it's this mystical concept. You can do it, but you can't really do it. And you can buy a laser, but you can't really buy a laser. It seems so difficult, but it also seems so simple. Please explain to me, does it work? Is it a myth? And also, if it works, is it possible for you to purchase a laser like that and actually do it at home? Is it something schools can actually try to incorporate?
So I think that's a meaningful question. So to demystify the whole thing about lasers and laser therapy, photobiomodulation and low light laser therapy. So it's definitely a modality that's worthwhile investing into. It's a red light specific frequency of laser therapy that causes your mitochondrial energy to optimize. And it's basically a great anti-inflammatory device. So it causes neuroinflammation to regulate down in a significant way, in ways that we haven't seen other non-invasive devices. Remember, all the methyl B12 we've been discussing previously, I mean, that's all injectables. So even though it's minimal invasive, a laser therapy device and photomodulation is non-invasive. So from a safety point of view, I mean, it carries obviously CE markings, it carries great research, peer-reviewed published articles, with outcomes. You obviously need to buy the real McCoy. You need to buy the real thing. So it needs to be certified to be at a specific wavelength and frequency, a specific light. Different lights have different applications as well, especially in the neurodevelopmental group. So I think from just a practical point of view, you're welcome to obviously have one either at home and you follow the instructions in the manual. So it's not this very complicated big thing that needs to be make a fuss about. I think it's a clever tool, very affordable tool. It doesn't have to cost you hundreds of thousands. It's really affordable and it carries great value.
NAD is a vital coenzyme found in every cell of the body, playing a central role in energy production, DNA repair, and overall cellular resistance. As we age, or when the body is under stress, NAD levels naturally decline, which can impact metabolism, cognitive function, and the body's ability to repair itself. I want to find out when it comes to NAD, is there any benefit to a child with autism or ADHD?
Yeah, so look, when it comes to NAD, I mean, the world is busy going mad for NAD. And all NAD really does is a mitochondrial stimulant. So a lot of the neurodevelopmental delayed children also show significant mitochondrial dysfunction. So it's a big word, but it basically means that the energy supply unit in your cells, the core energy production site, is on a bit of load shedding. So if that load shedding happens, that means your metabolism is lowered, your immune system is dysregulated, your energy production is not optimal, so you cannot repair and perform optimal, so chronic fatigue as well. And you also see children who's got hypotone, so they're not as toned and joints not as flexible and as sturdy as someone with optimal ATP and mitochondrial production. So you see a hypotoned child and hypotone in the way that they walk, the way they sit and slouch, the way they walk. You can see it in their posture. You can see it in their either tippy toes. You can see it in the way the joints are lax or rigid. So you can quickly spot the mitochondrial dysfunction patient, usually the ones with lower tones in their muscle mass.
In today's fast-paced world, gluten-laden breads and dairy-rich comforts are dietary cornerstones, yet they cause far more inflammation than we realize. While lactose intolerance grabs headlines, it is the resilient gluten proteins in wheat and the casein variants in cow's milk that frequently ignite immune responses. For sensitive individuals, strategic elimination can unlock profound anti-inflammatory relief, restoring balance and vitality. What impact does gluten and dairy have specifically on the gut?
Whenever you get gluten that enters a gut that's not in optimal shape or an optimal microenvironment, and you don't have the squeaky clean probiotic strands that you need to really get that patient's absorption going, nutritional depletions optimized, and even if you give them good food, if they cannot absorb and digest properly, then they're also not going to have and derive the benefits of it. So gluten for a gut that's sensitive, or a gut that's in a dysbiosis state, or a gut that's dysregulated, so that means either constipated, bloated, or at times even overflow diarrhea patterns. Any of those, you get a gut lining that's so sensitive to gluten that gluten actually causes a shredding effect or a tearing effect of the mucosal lining of your gut. So that's almost as if you have a Freddy Krueger with these 4 steel blades walking around in your colon and just slowly slicing and shredding through the mucosal lining, causing disconnection between the gut and brain immediately because it's an injury, it's a fight and flight. Your vagal nerve goes into a very different mode pertaining to digestion, and you've got this injury just lingering. And then that gluten is a genetically modified protein, it's a glycoprotein, and all of a sudden, if there's a genetic predisposition for something like celiac disease or leaky gut, it's going to activate that mutation and it's going to cause havoc in that specific patient's body and functions.
Is that what casein that we find in the dairy products, in the cow's milk products, is that the same effect that casein has, or does it look different?
So casein has the same irritation profile, the same immune response, and the same immune dysregulation effect. But because it's a protein that's genetically modified and altered, usually connected with a bit of growth hormone and antibiotics. It disrupts the whole gut biome in general, and the knock-on effect of casein is more neuroinflammation via the same pathway than just the direct blunt effect that gluten has on the mucosal lining.
Being aware of potential toxins can also help reduce unnecessary burden on the body. This may include exposure to heavy metals, certain household chemicals, air pollutants, pesticides, and artificial additives. While everyone encounters these to some degree, some individuals may experience greater effects due to the genetic, metabolic, or immune-related differences. On the internet, again, there's a lot of things available, and I hear a lot about heavy metals. It's a hot topic. How does this impact people with special needs?
So heavy metals fall into the same category as that culprit that pulls the trigger of the loaded gun. So heavy metals are often part of the cause of the environmental factors that actually are the leading cause of pulling that trigger for the genes to mutate and for those genetic polymorphisms to switch on and switch off in a specific fashion. So we love, as you know, to measure heavy metals. You either do it with a hair shaft analysis, which takes a little bit of time, or like the device that we have at the practice, where it's a non-invasive device and you really get actual functional readings of vitamins, minerals, what type of heavy metals our patients are burdened and toxined and laden with, and you can start to plan a very specific chelation IV protocol or chelation therapy protocol to get rid of those heavy metals that may be one of the big blocks for them into seeing advancements in their rehabilitation.
It's very scary to imagine that we've got heavy metals all around us. You know, you get it in the Teflon pans that we use. Devices, we get it through air pollution. It's all around us. So what would be the different things that we have to have in place to make sure that we just, as a normal person, would detox it out, flush it out? What would technically be the things we'd be looking for?
So once again, I go back and I'd say from a practical point of view, be careful of just overusing those Teflon pans, plastic bottles, plastic compounds, and reusable items. Be very careful of those ones. Natural remedies that tend to really act as very weak or moderate chelators. That means in catching that heavy metal and actually eliminating that and detoxifying the body of it. Could be something as mild as a magnesium supplement. Could be something as mild as fresh herbs in your salads and in your foods. So oregano and thyme, timi as we call it in South Africa, very, very good oral chelators. And then the compounding pharmacies obviously supply us with either suppositories or tablets, oral capsules, or intravenous infusion of chelation IVs that we can actually trap those heavy metals. We can measure them. You can see how much of the heavy metal we excrete in urine, and you can actually monitor the patient very scientifically.
Imagine tiny uninvited guests. Parasites like Toxoplasma from cat litter or undercooked meat, or gut dwellers from contaminated water, hitching a ride in your body without a peep. For kids and adults with ADHD or autism, these critters aren't harmless hitchhikers. They can mess with brain chemistry, ramp up inflammation, and crank symptoms like hyperactivity, focus fog, or sensory overload, especially if picked up early in life. Studies spotlight Toxoplasma as a sneaky aggravator, linking it to worse ADHD traits and even autism-like brain tweaks. The good news? Testing and targeted treatments can evict them, erasing the chaos and boosting clarity. Doc, so I am aware that we all carry some passengers, parasites. What does a person or a patient with some parasites look like? What do they present like?
So in young patients who haven't been potty trained, they are typically those patients who would be doing some stool inspections. That's a very, very layman's clue to tell you, listen, there is a sudden spike and overgrowth of the nematodes and the parasites and the larvae stages, and that you can definitely warrant then for an elimination protocol or just a removal protocol and an antifungal, antiparasitic protocol. So that's a typical one. If you have a patient that's non-vocal, non-verbal, all of a sudden they present with high-pitching noises, inappropriate little giggle or a laugh every now and then, And not if they're watching a funny cartoon with you, but they just respond a little bit later. Literally just an inappropriate little giggle or laughter could give you cues on there might be some passengers that are busy taking over a gut microbiome. And then it's time for a parasite cleanse and really just get rid of those additional passengers.
How do you get rid of passengers? What would be your protocol?
So I would take a very broad spectrum anti-helminthic and a very broad spectrum antifungal regime. And it's usually a once or twice a day regime or just a once off remedy where you get rid of the bulk of it, and then you start to repopulate your gut with a prebiotic and some good fibers. Start to incorporate some L-glutamine, a non-essential amino acid that really just helps you seal up the lining of your gut again, and then to repopulate with a very good broad spectrum probiotic. So it's always good to know what organism you're treating. So stool samples, comprehensive digestive stool analysis is probably the best one. You get the oats test, organic acid test, just to see what breakdown products of some pathogens could be predicted in a patient's gut and in a stool sample. So from a medical point of view, I think the leaky gut is very underplayed and very under-discussed in a lot of medical circles. And just because it sounds like the previous decades, we refer to it as just spastic colon or irritable bowel syndrome. People tend to think it's just old wives' tale and just a little bit of stress or that time of the month for the ladies. And the doctors really underplay the importance of a healthy gut microbe and a healthy gut microbiome.
Antibiotics are invaluable for treating bacterial infections such as earaches or strep throat. However, early exposure can disrupt the gut microbiome by depleting beneficial bacteria. This imbalance may impair the gut-brain axis, contributing to heightened hyperactivity, attention difficulties, sensory sensitivities, or an increased risk of neurodevelopmental disorders. Fortunately, interventions like probiotics and dietary adjustments can alleviate symptoms. What happens when we take antibiotics?
So what does antibiotic stand for? It stands for anti and bios, so anti-life. And antibiotic, the minute you ingest it, I mean, it makes no exception if it's a normal living passenger that's supposed to be there, a normal symbiotic organism, or a pathogen that doesn't belong there. So it kills off all life. So it disrupts the gut. I remember there was this study that University of Potchefstroom did back in early 2000s where there was a big meningococ outbreak. So that's a bug that causes severe meningitis in some cases. And there was this outbreak of meningitis on campus. And all the students had to take one stat dosage of an antibiotic to counteract the meningitis strand. And on the lab side, what the professor saw was that even on the genetic spectrums, the DNA profile, the DNA sequencing of the students that participated in some of the trials while this outbreak was going on, the whole DNA helix and double helixes, we know that little ladder with all the rods in between, was disrupted, and it scattered the entire DNA pattern of the students who were partaking in the clinical trials, and they had to then reverse engineer and go back and see what the disruption was. And it was one stat dosage of antibiotics that scattered an entire DNA analysis and DNA genome sequencing just from one antibiotic. So think now of antibiotics that we prescribe, a 3-day course, once a day for 3 days, a 5-day course, twice a day for 5 days. Patients with resistant organisms and just methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, for instance, a very toxic drug and a very big cause of concern in hospitals, they go on to multiple antibiotics intravenously 14 to 21 days. So guess what happens to those DNA patterns and DNA genome sequencing, gut microbiome, so everything just, it's a disarray and it disconnects and disrupts and dysregulates the entire gut microbiome. So very important to use with caution, obviously whenever needed and when necessary, and when those stool cultures come back and you see there's a very specific organism with a specific sensitivity, you treat for that specific organism and not just give a very broad spectrum antibiotic and hope that everything dies off.
Is it really true that antibiotics would lower your immune system?
So the way it does it is by that whole increasing the intestinal permeability explanation of earlier. So it disrupts the microcosmos of the gut. It disrupts the lining physically of the gut because of toxic compounds. If you've got a slow functioning digestive tract, i.e. constipated, then you've got these toxins sitting in your colon for all the longer. And if they get the opportunity to seep back into your bloodstream, you've got partially broken down metabolites that now cause new secondary waves of free radical disruptions and free radical spurts. New wave of inflammation just starting to rise up. And I mean, if you've got your neurotransmitter production disconnected, you've got your methylation burdened, so that's now all your B vitamins needing to do all the neurotransmitter formation and production, and you deplete them because you seed all your energy, all your vitamins, all your nutrients for getting rid of the injury or getting rid of the infection, then the body goes into that depleted state. So once it's in that depleted state, that's where you get the mood swings, the poor sleeping, the personality failures that happen in the office, at school, everywhere. And we just see a lot of this happening. And then also remember, viruses do not respond to antibiotics. So what doctors, including me, were very guilty of up until 2003 is just ad hoc, just prescribing an antiviral with a concomitant antibiotic just for in case a secondary bacterial infection was about to happen. So from an overprescription point of view, I do think that we as doctors are often very guilty. Very few doctors do consider repopulating the gut with a probiotic strand or prebiotic even, just bracing that gut for that injury coming. And I think there's a lot to learn and a lot we can share still in the community with our fellow prescribers to actually prescribe very responsibly.
Chemical medications are cornerstones for addressing symptoms in ADHD and autism. However, ADHD is not a Ritalin deficiency, and autism is not a Risperdal deficiency. These medications, while sometimes helpful for symptom relief, carry significant risks and do not address the root cause of the condition. By treating each patient as a unique individual with their own history, genetics, lifestyle, and underlying imbalances, we can develop targeted, effective treatment plans that improves quality of life. Do you think there's a space for some of these medications like Risperdal, Ritalin, Concerta on the market? Do you think there's a space for that?
Some patients really have disabilities, and we can at some stage maybe just talk about when you have a true disability or disorder, or when it's just a challenge or a trait or just a season of dysfunction. So depending on where on the spectrum the patient falls and where the challenges lie, you can definitely be sure that the pharmaceutical companies have done their homework on specifically stimulants. So there's a specific indication for it. We understand the nutrient depletion profile. So if I have a severely disabled patient and I know that a stimulant for a specific indication short term will be beneficial, I prescribe it, as you know. I make sure that I inform the patients that there are nutrient depletions ascribed to that specific chemical, and we make sure that we don't get them into a depleted state, but we do supplement wisely just to minimize the effect and the side effect profile of that chemical. And if they derive any benefit from it, especially if it comes to a very aggressive, self-injurious, self-harming spectrum child, then it really makes sense to help the parents just to get them into not a worsened but an improved condition and improved state, while we're busy doing other modalities, figuring out how we can play a regenerative part in their lives and help to get them to heal injuries quicker and more optimally.
If a parent is listening to this and they feel quite overwhelmed, what would be a good message, a good take home that you would tell parents where to start?
So I would probably recommend that they start with very small steps, very achievable, measurable, short, small steps in the beginning. I would probably start at the meal plan. Meal plan happens at least 2 or 3 times a day. That could be an injury or it could be a step towards healing. So I would start with a meaningful adjustment of, say, 1 food group at least. And you can do it over 2 weeks. and then swap it out for another food group to replace and see if you do actually notice a little bit of a behavioral difference. I would start with maybe one meaningful supplement. So if inflammation is suspected, to go for a high potency omega-3 or turmeric supplement. If it's something to do with sleep hygiene, I would probably recommend that we get the circadian rhythm into a better space. If it's a very anxious patient, I would consider a neurotransmitter such as GABA aminobutyric acid. It's like the very calming inhibitory neurotransmitter, a dimmer switch as I like to refer to it, just gives the child the ability to tone down, less anxious, less panicky, better with sleep induction. That's your first initial part of sleep where you just need to actually fall asleep. And then with a little bit of a top-up of melatonin perhaps, even with or without a chemical at nighttime to help them sleep through. But then you're at least giving neuroregenerative molecules following a more circadian natural rhythm of day-night neurotransmitter profiling. And I would probably tell them that it's a marathon. So this is in for a long-term strategy, a long run. So don't start the race very fast, otherwise you're going to fatigue somewhere in the middle and you're not going to make a good end race. So don't view it as a 100-meter dash, but actually see it as this marathon and long distance running, and the athlete has to run very strategically, very wisely. So start with 1 or 2 modalities, monitor for 2 to 4 weeks, and then start incorporating new ones.
Doc, so let's say there's now this child with autism or ADHD, and we've gone through the process of stopping the injury from going further. We are stopping the inflammation. We are dealing with the different genes. We are dealing with the methylation. We're dealing with the detoxification. So we're really doing what we can. Is this for life? Or, is there a point where a child improves so much and reaches milestones where parents can relax and say, okay, now we can start eating gluten again and we don't have to buy all these expensive injections? Is it a lifelong thing, or does it end at a point?
So remember, the gene mutations are there in the recipe, and it's inscribed in the recipe for life. The way we switch them on and off pertain to lifestyle modification and poor or wise decisions we make, pertaining to meals and our environments. And I think once we have silenced a gene mutation with regenerative strategies, for instance, there is a period of catch-up and regeneration that can happen. And if the parents then at some stage decide to go back to normal living or normal eating, it's them not fully grasping the effect of a genetic recipe that's mutated and glitched for life. So they need to appreciate the fact that, yes, even though in seasons you can do gene silencing techniques and therapies and offer them to patients, we need to be mindful of really planning that it's a lifelong strategy, and for the whole family to actually buy in and support that patient, especially the one with a challenge.
Living with ADHD or autism isn't a battle to win overnight. It's a vibrant, ongoing adventure where small intentional shifts in lifestyle can rewrite your story. Imagine trading chaos for clarity, nourishing your body with anti-inflammatory foods, carving out routines that honor your unique wiring, and weaving in movement, mindfulness, and meaningful connections. These aren't quick fixes. They're lifelong allies that quiet the mental storm, sharpen focus, and unlock hidden strengths. Science backs it. Consistent sleep, gut-friendly habits, and stress busters can dial down symptoms by up to 30%, fostering resilience and joy.